Welcome to Engage, leading conversations that matter. Join in the conversation. Send an email to engage@cfpublic.org. Send a recorded talkback message on the free Central Florida Public Media app. Leave a voicemail by calling 407-273-2300, extension 246. Engage is made possible with the support of listeners like you.
You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. It's Thursday, September 19th. Coming up, we'll hear from a group of Central Florida voters about how they approach political disagreements with friends and family. Also, Tupperware declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy yesterday, but that company has a history of empowering women in post-war America. We'll learn how Tupperware parties help spur the equal rights movement. And the Orlando Museum of Art rolls out a new exhibit highlighting the art of the punk movement. Producer Richard Copeland stops by the OMA to rock out with one of the curators. First, though, some tough times for the restaurant business here in Central Florida. Recently, a steady stream of eateries in our area announced they're shutting down, struggling, or restructuring. The Hammered Lamb held a fundraiser on Saturday just to try and stay open. Ethos Vegan Kitchen, Farm and House, Tijuana Flats, Hawkers, and national chains like Red Lobster, BurgerFi, Anthony's Cold Fire Pizza. That's just some of the places declaring bankruptcy or outright closing in recent weeks. Orlando Business Journal reporter Sarah Kinbar covers hospitality, restaurants, bars, and nightlife. She joined Engage yesterday to talk about how the food scene is changing and why bankruptcy is actually a survival strategy for some of these businesses. We also talked about the trends that she's seeing happening specifically in Central Florida restaurants. Kinbar started our conversation by explaining why Thornton Park mainstay Graffiti Junction was forced to close over the summer.
I spoke with the owner, Greg Peters, and he said it was just too expensive to keep it going. He said the overall economy made it untenable. There were upgrades that needed to be made to the facility. Labor costs were high, food was expensive, and he just decided it was time to move on. With Tijuana Flats, that's a chain, but it's locally based. They got underwater with expensive leases. And so when they filed for bankruptcy, it gave them an opportunity for a fresh start. And I think it's important to note that Chapter 11 does not mean the end. Sometimes it can mean a new beginning. Hawkers, that is a really interesting case because Hawkers has actually been doing well. They say that revenue is strong. They haven't missed a payment on loans, but what happened with them is they got into trouble with their debt to net worth threshold. They hit a certain mark and their lender said, oh, we want to own you now because they put up ownership of their restaurant group as collateral. So luckily for them, they found a really good attorney and filed for Chapter 11 very quickly, which is going to protect them and most likely going to give them a shot at reorganizing their debt and moving forward.
A couple of follow-ups for you. I'll go with the bankruptcy that you mentioned and how it could be kind of a fresh beginning. Is it somewhat of a strategy then for some small businesses to declare bankruptcy? Because I would argue that when people hear bankruptcy, they think, oh, that's it. It's the end for them.
Yes, it's definitely a strategic move. Chapter 11 is about reorganization. It's not about liquidation. That would be Chapter 7. So with Chapter 11, it's about figuring out how to shed some debt, how to identify if there's multiple locations, figuring out which are the least profitable and closing those, and then building on the strongest parts of the business to go forward. And most importantly, I think, to preserve jobs. With really, really small restaurants, like some of the ones that we really love here in Orlando, like Hammered Lamb. The owner there, Jason Lambert, also owns Jack and Honey's, 2 restaurants. That's a really tough situation. I imagine that they're dealing with the same thing that was happening at Graffiti Junction, which is labor is expensive, food is expensive, and the overall economy just makes it very difficult to keep going.
Sarah, have you had any findings about market saturation? How many chicken tender restaurants can possibly thrive in one market, for example? Is that an issue in Central Florida?
Okay, so I talk a lot to franchises that are either already set up in Central Florida or looking to come into Central Florida, and nobody is talking about market saturation. And these are folks that are looking at data and making data-driven decisions about where they want to put down roots. And Central Florida is one of the most appealing markets in the United States for franchises. And, on my way to work, sometimes I pass by the new Raising Cane's that's on Semarin in Winter Park. And it's wild how many people are in line there. And there's a couple of restaurants in that cluster, and they have a parking problem and they have a traffic problem because so many people are flooding those restaurants. And I'm not sure how or why so many people want chicken tenders, but they do. Another reason why a lot of franchises don't consider Orlando a market that could be saturated is because we have this incredible tourist traffic. And you'll see a concentration of many restaurants in the tourist corridor. And for those of us who live here, maybe it feels like too much, but the franchises don't think so.
Can you talk to what is so appealing about Central Florida to franchises? And I'm wondering if it also means then that the small, long-time, family-owned businesses, is there a threat to them that's not being able to compete with these big franchises?
I think that there is. I think there is because the franchisers are backed by big dollars. There's a lot of money behind it. If you look at what happened, for example, well, Red Lobster, it's not a franchise, but it's a chain. But with Red Lobster, what happened is they were underwater and they weren't going to make it. Fortress Investment Group has, taken over the business and they're investing $60 million to turn around that restaurant chain. That's not money that a mom and pop shop is going to have to play with. The bigger chains definitely have deeper pockets and can buoy themselves financially during challenging times.
In the case of Red Lobster specifically, is that a trend that you see happening across other national brands?
Where like a big investment group comes in and takes over?
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, it's been happening. It's not new, actually. The gentleman who was the interim CEO at Red Lobster, Jonathan Tibus, has a long track record of being an interim CEO at one restaurant chain after the next, where he goes in and reorganizes, figures out how to make the restaurant chain profitable, and then moves on. And he's been doing that for 2 decades.
What are you hearing from other businesses, owners, operators in the area? Is there any sense of panic from them that you're gathering in your reporting?
I spoke with the owner of Credo about having to close his location in downtown Orlando. And what was interesting there is his year over year revenue had tripled and things were looking really good. And he had to, renew his lease. Air Commercial came to him with a number that he couldn't afford. And so he had to move out. So even though business was good, he couldn't afford the space. And I do hear that quite a bit.
Interesting. I think that is also what played a role in Cappy's Subs in Maitland initially closing down for good before we found out that they would be reopening.
Yes. Yeah, I think so too. And then you have Bloodhound Brew, which a lot of people really loved that spot over at the Conroy Kirkman intersection there. Something happened. The previous owner wanted to sell it to them. They couldn't afford it. So they stayed put when the new owner came in, hoping that they would be able to lease from them. And the new owner actually offered them a buyout on their lease, didn't even offer them the opportunity to increase rent and stay or anything like that. So they had to move out. So yeah, I think that having access to property, having access to space that's affordable is really challenging. Actually, Don Julio's restaurant group has been leasing space for all of their restaurants, but they just bought their first space in Sanford where they're going to build out a restaurant. And they're leaning in that direction of actually buying space to ensure that they have somewhere to do business.
So with people talking about all these restaurants, I named in the beginning, just some of them like Pom Poms, Hammered Lamb, Graffiti Junction, these places that are closing or in danger of closing. What's the takeaway for you in terms of what is happening in the Central Florida market?
I think that the Smaller, individually owned restaurants are in jeopardy. I think that for locals, it's really sad. For the restaurant owners, it's really sad. These are restaurants that we love, that we've had so many memories that we've collected over the years, where we want to keep going and continuing to make new memories and enjoying the food. And in some cases, that's not going to happen.
Am I being dramatic if I'm wondering, could that change the food scene in this area long term?
I think it could. It could change the food scene. Yes, I think that the restaurateurs that are backed by big dollars are going to have a better shot of going the distance. And I think that's just how it's going to be. Unfortunately, that there's going to be fewer people that can play in that space. I think that the pandemic changed things for people. I think that people got pickier about what would get them out of the house and spending money at a restaurant. And I think that restaurants have to do more to bring people through their doors. And just real quick, if we look at what Greg Peters from Graffiti Junction is doing now, he opened The View in Claremont, which is it's a restaurant. They've got a food hall. They've got 2 bars, indoor and out. They have a driving range. They have live music on the weekends and sometimes on weeknights. They have cornhole tournaments. It's an experience that's meant to keep the whole family there for many, many hours. And the idea there is, the longer people are there, the less likely that they'll go somewhere else to spend their money. They're going to hang out at the View. And that's going very well for Greg. And he's looking at expanding nationally. And he's actually looking for a second spot right now in Nashville. And that's because he's figured something out. He's figured out how to have a restaurant and to make it enough of an experience that people want to come.
Sarah Kinbar is a reporter at Orlando Business Journal. So is the party over for the iconic Central Florida-based Tupperware brands, or can it be saved for later? They filed for bankruptcy this week. Next, we'll look at how the Tupperware empire transformed the workforce and created some new opportunities for women. All of our shows are available on demand at cfpublic.org. Thank you for listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. Ahead on this program, the Orlando Museum of Art unveils a new exhibit on Saturday highlighting the punk rock movement. And we stopped by to ask, what is punk?
It's actually a way of approaching life in a lot of ways. It's about having a do-it-yourself mentality. It's about not taking no for an answer and kind of doing whatever you want to do and not really caring about anybody else.
We will talk with the OMA co-curator Michael Worthington about the Torn Apart exhibit and all things punk rock. First, though, Tupperware declared Chapter 11 yesterday. It doesn't mean they're going out of business. They're restructuring debt, but it does make them vulnerable. Tupperware was founded in Grafton, Massachusetts in 1938, but moved the company headquarters to Kissimmee in 1951. Founder Earl Tupper gets the credit for inventing the opaque plastic containers, but the company's success can be claimed by a woman named Brownie Wise, the brains behind the Tupperware party sales pitch. Bob Keeling is a local Florida historian who wrote the book Life of the Party about the Tupperware empire. He joined Engage to talk about how Tupperware provided women with a revenue stream in a time when they were discouraged from or even forbidden from working outside of their homes. Keeling joined Engage producer Richard Copeland earlier today.
Before Brownie Wise met Earl Tupper, she was a secretary at Bendix in suburban Detroit. And unfortunately, her marriage went south. She had a son to raise. So she started selling products for the Stanley Company. And they had an early form of the door-to-door salesman kind of stuff. But the products were kind of utilitarian, not like Tupperware. But that's how she started getting into that orbit in the late 1940s.
Now, she found a lot of success with this sort of party plan model. How did she and Earl Tupper find each other and sort of combined, it's almost a perfect storm of the right product and the right marketing scheme.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this would be one of the greatest examples in American history when you look at the success of it. But in Detroit, Brownie had a young teenage protege who found a piece of Tupperware sort of languishing on the shelf of a department store in Detroit. And he brought it to her and said, this would be a great demonstration product. His name was Gary McDonald, and he ended up being a legend in the Tupperware company also. But she started putting it in her line of Stanley products. And when Stanley eventually told her, hey, management is no place for a woman, honey, back in the day. So she said, I'll show you, started selling Tupperware. And Tupper was doing sort of market research. And he realizes that this woman, this entity in Detroit is selling a ton of his product. So he sends a guy out there to ask her, what's the key to your success and how do we incorporate it around the rest of the country? She told him, and that was the very beginning of the home party sales system. They hired her, sent her down here to Florida.
Talk about the success of this strategy in post-war America, not just for Tupperware. There was a bunch of companies that built up brand names doing this, Amway, Avon. It was so successful that Tupperware pulled their products out of stores to sell it exclusively this way. So talk about the landscape of America that helped facilitate this.
Sure. Well, people like Brownie were smart enough to realize that this product had to be demonstrated. And it also gave it a cachet in post-World War II America. So they convinced Earl Tupper early on, from the very beginning, you can't sell this in stores because people don't know how to use it. We have to show people how to burp it. And that's why they came up with this sort of feminized way of selling the product through the home parties. But it also was very effective in showing this product works. When you're throwing a sealed bowl of grape juice across someone's family room, it better work.
Earl Tupper and Brownie Wise have a pretty acrimonious parting of ways. What happened to Brownie Wise?
Well, Brownie had been put up on a pedestal very intentionally as the quote unquote it girl of Tupperware. And she attracted a lot of publicity. Cosmopolitan, all kinds of, before Cher and Madonna and Oprah, there was a single name celebrity by the name of Brownie. And she even wrote a woman's self-help book called Best Wishes she self-published in 1957. Today, that would be, very, very, that's a matter of course for a woman in business. But back then it was very unusual. And Tupper felt like she had her eye off the ball. And it was becoming more about her than his baby. And then there was, they had these annual jubilees, and there was a major issue here in Central Florida, down in Kissimmee, where they had some distributors on an island, and it got late, and storms rolled in, and there wasn't cover for them, and it was a real Waterloo. So it was a combination of those things, along with the fact that Tupper was thinking about selling the company, that he decided it was time for Brownie to go.
And Tupper does eventually sell the company, and he himself, he fades into obscurity despite his name, even until today, being part of household vernacular.
Yeah, Tupper was just so paranoid about taxes and other things that after he sold the company to Rexall Drugs in 1958 for $16 million, he ends up renouncing his citizenship, buying his own island down in Central America, and living out the rest of his life. But he was a very charitable person, and he did donate a lot of money for the charities that he believed in. And that's also part of his legacy. But everyone will remember him for the brilliant product that he based on a paint can, and the rest is history.
And we've talked about, this business success story and this legacy of this food containment product that just about everybody has in their house. But in the bigger picture, this sales strategy of these parties did something a little bit more, and it provided a level of empowerment for women in an era where there wasn't a lot of places to find that.
That's exactly right. Women were able to get out of the kitchen and make their own money with a product that really worked. And they, could sell it intentionally, knowing they could lean in today's vernacular that this product worked. It will stretch your household budget. It will reduce food waste and keep your leftovers fresh longer. And they didn't need an MBA. But make no mistake, there were no stock options, there were no golden parachutes. So the people who decided to invest so much equity in this product, in this company, were doing so at their own peril, because they really weren't even employees of Tupperware. They were independent agents, but it built businesses, it built families, it built communities. And here in Central Florida, it was the Magic Kingdom long before Disney.
And at a time where there were even less opportunities for women of color, Tupperware provided some of those opportunities.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. There was a distributor by the name of Anna Tate from the DC area who just would not stand for her dealers of color being treated as second-class citizens. And indeed, Tupperware very early on went into Jim Crow Black communities in America, because those folks, you could certainly argue that they needed to stretch their household budgets more than anyone else. And so, yes, that's another part of the legacy of Tupperware, was their inclusive attitude about who to sell to and who could be part of the sales force.
Could you say that this was a building brick in the foundation of the ascent of the women's movement that grew up in the 60s and 70s?
I think you could argue that the glass ceiling was definitely shattered through the help of Tupperware, and women could get in on the ground floor and then see their ambition and their station in life be determined by how hard they were willing to work and sell the product. And indeed, some of them ended up becoming very successful distributors and making a lot of money. And the thing that I found endearing about the Tupperware story, especially during the salad days, the heydays of the late 1950s and early 60s, was how it was one hand helping up a newbie. And in that way, there was such an esprit de corps, and it was women helping women out of the kitchen. But as Brownie Wise said, look, I'm not some kind of liberator. I wasn't really a feminist. I was just someone who needed to make money. So it attracted people from all sorts of that philosophical spectrum. But that is absolutely a part of Tupperware's legacy before Mary Kay and before many of the imitators came along.
So in 2016, the Tupperware Company donated $200,000 to Florida's Osceola County to establish a conservation area and Brownie Wise Park on a parcel of land that used to be occupied by her on Lake Toho. Where else do we see the legacy of Tupperware, of Brownie Wise throughout these Central Florida communities?
I applauded Tupperware when they did donate that money to establish something so specific and permanent for Brownie Wise on the peninsula, where she lived in a lavish home until she was unceremoniously fired and told she had to move out of the house because she didn't own it. But that's ancient history. That was 1958. In more recent times, they also established what was called a Chain of Confidence Center. It was like their museum. And it had Earl Tupper's valise with all of his drawings, but it also established Brownie on the same level with him in terms of the successful yin and the yang that started this worldwide phenomenon known as Tupperware. And I can't tell you how many people have said, oh yeah, our graduation was held down at the Tupperware auditorium. Many people came to Central Florida because of the product. Marilyn Manello, for instance, the great art benefactor, after whom the Manello Museum is named in Orlando. She was married to the president of the company at one time and was a former distributor herself. So it's just Tupperware is part of the fabric of this community, and it holds a special place in people's hearts because that's really where their family lives began for many of them when they relocated down in Orlando in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond. And they still have the Jubilee today. So the tradition continues, but with this bankruptcy, it is a significant challenge, and it remains to be seen how the company emerges from bankruptcy protection.
That was Bob Keeling, a local historian, author of Life of the Party, the remarkable story of how Brownie Wise built and lost a Tupperware party empire, speaking with Engage producer Richard Copeland. As part of an ongoing effort to understand how Central Floridians are feeling this election year and what's driving people to make the decisions they make, Central Florida Public Media brought together people from different backgrounds to talk. Social media and politics turned out to be an important topic. That might be something you can relate to. Have you ever been offended by something a friend or family member posted? Yeah, it can be difficult to communicate with the people you care about, but also just fundamentally disagree with. Today we hear from 68-year-old Doug Bowman from East Orlando, a registered Republican, 69-year-old Melbourne resident Tom Unrath, also a registered Republican, and 64-year-old David Walker of Harmony near St. Cloud. Walker is an independent who admittedly leans left. They spoke with Central Florida Public Media News Director LaToya Dennis.
We see whatever is chosen by those wonderful algorithms to be amplified as becoming the view that this is the norm. And I, like the others here, no, I want to believe, no, we're not in those two extremes. It is sometimes entertaining, but I will also say that, there are relatives and friends who I will snooze for 30 minutes or 30 days on Facebook because they amplify things that I know aren't factual.
Do you ever say, hey, that's not factual, or is it not worth it?
I'm very careful with my comments back. I choose those very carefully because of the nature of where we are at, because that view could get amplified and the wrong people could, in fact, interpret it differently than it was intended. And I always say that English is such a precise language, particularly the written part of English. If you can't have a face-to-face conversation and see the facial reactions and the body language and all that goes with that, you have a higher probability of misinterpreting what those words actually are. And so social media is a written word in most cases. I'm not a TikToker or, Instagram type person, but, because of the extremism in some cases, a misunderstanding there can be catastrophic. And so, yes, sometimes I do. I've had some very interesting discussions with very close friends, but I know that they're open to having those discussions and recognize that we don't have to agree, but they're willing to listen.
Did you want to add something?
I was just going to say, can you say no to people and say, no, that's not right? Again, as Doug said, it kind of depends on the circumstance. In my family, there are some folks with which I do not agree, and I do not agree very strongly. And there are some things that we just don't talk about. Now, we still love each other, but we know where the fences are. And as the saying goes, good fence make good neighbors. But at the same time, I do want to be inclusive. And I want to make sure that others are as well. My last job in the Air Force was at the Defense Equal Opportunity Management Institute. It's a place where people go for training as they head off to be advisors to commanders about equity, inclusion, biases, so on. I taught classes on religious diversity, religious accommodation, religious discrimination, but I took classes while there about gender diversity and bias and discrimination and racial and so on. And when I see it now, I can recognize it better, and I'm able to call it out. I have to admit, sadly, I don't always. But there have been times, and I'll also admit that it's been mostly with people that I don't expect to have any further relationship with. But that's I think, something that's important for all of us to do if we are going to be good neighbors, if we're going to be caring about each other, all of us, to say to someone that's not doing the right thing, say, I'm sorry, that's just not the right thing.
I try to stay away from responding to things that I disagree with, especially with friends. But recently I had a college professor, and I've been knowing him since I was 18 years of age, and I'm 64 now. So I've been knowing him a long time, and we know each other's family. He's done things for me. We work together. I've been over his house. We've just done a lot of things together. And a few years ago, I realized that we had different opinions on politics, but I wouldn't get into him whenever he posted something. I just would just ignore it and keep going. But the other day, someone had posted a picture of the Democratic nominee with a Jeffrey Epstein, and it was a Photoshop picture. It was really her with her husband, and they put Jeffrey Epstein next to her as to indicate, And so my friend reposted it, and that bothered me. It bothered me because in my mind, what he was doing was as I said to him, because I said, listen, you're going to always be my guy, but this is nothing but following the leader. Because it's wrong, it's in error, you did no fact checking. And then that tells me a lot about you, that you're a man of integrity, family, and all this kinds of stuff. And now you're being moved by this wave over here that would just do anything. For the first time, I responded because I felt like how you have a family member. Sometimes you just have to say something, but you have to say it in a way where you don't now break the bond, but then you can't ignore it. Because sometimes people continue what they do because no one ever, as we would say, check them. Have to say something. So I said it very respectfully, and he kind of got it, and he apologized and asked how could he take it down. And so that kind of bothered me, but I stay away from it because I refuse to allow a particular person, party, influence, whether it's a cult or not, to affect my relationship with people. Because when they're gone, now what are you going to do with the people who you love and your family with? Now everybody's broken, but that person has done gone off the scene, and now you got a broken family.
You just heard from Doug Bowman from East Orlando, Melbourne resident Tom Unrath, and David Walker of Harmony. The conversation was part of a listening series where Central Florida Public Media did in-person small group meetings across our coverage area from Kissimmee to the Villages to find out what's driving people to the polls this year. You can hear the full series on our website, cfpublic.org. Coming up, a rebellious movement that materialized in the 70s influenced decades of music and culture that followed. Its story is on display in Orlando soon. If you're heading out, you can listen to Central Florida Public Media's Engage live on the radio at 90.7 FM in Greater Orlando and the Space Coast and 89.5 FM in Ocala and the Villages. Or you can stream us live at cfpublic.org or on the free Central Florida Public Media app. You can also tell your smart speaker to play Central Florida Public Media. You are listening to Engage. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. In the late 1970s, a new form of music and fashion hit the streets to counter the frilly, coiffed hair and flared jeans of the post-hippie era. Punk brought a grimy aesthetic born out of the remnants of Andy Warhol's factory in New York and the economically distressed neighborhoods of North and East London. Obviously, the kids loved it, And it proved to be more than a fad, as the punk movement is alive and well. From the suburban garages spawning teenage dreams of rock and roll hedonism to the reunion tours of stalwarts like New Order and The Cure. Saturday, that ethos is going to be captured by the Orlando Museum of Art's Torn Apart exhibit, showcasing the art of punk, capturing fashion and promotional posters from 1976, 1986, from Iggy Pop and the Sex Pistols, all the way into the MTV 80s, including the Police and the Eurythmics. Producer Richard Copeland stopped by the OMA to nerd out with exhibit co-curator Michael Worthington, a veteran of the English punk scene. As they toured the exhibit, Worthington started their conversation by reminiscing about his first brush with punk rock.
I can remember my best friend's older brother playing Nevermind the Bollocks and having it on vinyl and listening to it and being, oh my God, this is unlike anything I have ever heard in my life. This sounds like youth. It just sounded like so much energy, and it was just like, I want to be part of this. I want to find out what this is and what's going on with it. And when I was a little bit older, I was the person with the terrible mohawk as well.
You mentioned Nevermind the Bollocks, and my experience has been anytime you get 3 or more punks in a room, the conversation will inevitably resort to who's the first punk band, what's the first punk album. Nevermind the Bollocks is often cited. Typically the conversations go back to Iggy Pop, the MC5, the Velvet Underground. What's your take?
I think you divide it up into 3 different sections. So for me, there's what some people call proto-punk, which is really the New York scene, which is, the Ramones, Talking Heads, Blondie, Iggy Pop, even going back to New York Dolls and then connecting back to the Velvet Underground. It's all connected together. In a lot of ways, it's all just this development of rock and roll, actually. I mean, the mythology that punk blew everything apart and wasn't part of rock and roll is kind of a myth. I mean, a self-fabricated myth in a way. And I think that myth really came about when the sort of proto-punk American scene then moved, 76, it moves over to England. And basically it's in London, and then suddenly you have the Clash and the Sex Pistols and the Buzzcocks in Manchester.
The Damned.
And The Damned, first British vinyl punk single, The Damned. So it kind of changes. And then, and at that time, there was not a lot of communication between everybody. People weren't flying around to America all the time. There was no internet.
It was homegrown fanzines.
Yeah, everything was kind of homegrown, and those kind of subcultures were pretty insular in a way. So it makes sense that a lot of those bands, a lot of those people would be like, oh no, I see punk rock as this, because for them that was the origin of the scene. And then for me, the third part of it is what kind of happens from 78 onwards, which is really what you would now call kind of post-punk.
Is punk music? Is it a fashion aesthetic? Is it a political movement? Is it an attitude? Is it all of the above?
I would say all of the above, but mainly I think it's an approach to things. It's a kind of philosophy in a way. So a lot of people want to tie it to a certain style of music, and it can be a descriptor for that kind of music. But I also think more than that, it's actually a way of approaching life in a lot of ways. It's about having a do-it-yourself mentality. It's about not taking no for an answer and kind of doing whatever you want to do and not really caring about anybody else. But also, if you look at a lot of the things that came out of punk, a lot of that has a really good social and political conscience as well. It's not the kind of the very aggressive shock tactics that you see really early on in 76, where people are trying to upset their parents, basically. Later on, it's a very social and politically conscious movement.
Let's take a look at some of the art.
Sure. This first wall is a set of posters that were made by Stiff Records and designed by Barney Bubbles, who was a fantastic designer who'd actually had been designing record sleeves for a while before punk came along. He'd actually designed for Hawkwind. He designed the first poster for Glastonbury Festival. But he was really the kind of the voice of Stiff Records. And so these are sort of an entryway into the exhibition, a starting point, if you like, of seeing where it came from, coming out of kind of pub rock and coming out of rock and roll and starting to move into a slightly different sound that could be categorized as new wave or punk.
So on this wall, we're seeing some of and these are names that I think listeners would recognize more. I see the Sex Pistols, the Clash, the Damned, the Ramones, Blondie, and Blondie and Ramones are part of that New York scene you were talking about.
Yeah, so this is the kind of outer walls of the exhibition, and those are roughly follow a chronology that we'd already talked about. So starting from really the kind of proto-punk days, so you can see the Ramones and Blondie, Suicide, and then starting to get into the beginning of things happening in England with the 101ers, Joe Strummer's first band, and then the Clash, the Sex Pistols, the Adverts, the Damned. And it really follows, the outer walls kind of follow that chronology, and by showing these posters, it makes it very visual as well. So it's not just the names of the bands and the dates that they were playing at, it's actually the aesthetics that go along with it as well. And you can see how that gets developed by certain designers as well. So, I mean, one of the other things in the show is there's a fashion component to the show. So there's a lot of original clothes from the time period, from 76, 77, 78. There's some clothes that were reissued in the 80s by the original manufacturers. So it's really interesting to see the relationship between kind of the music and the graphic design and the fashion all kind of coming together, especially with Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren.
And you sort of see that bondage aesthetic that was coming into that fashion here.
Yeah, and part of that again was trying to be shocking. I mean, there's there's also a lot of the shirts where the graphics are appropriated from places, and they're trying to really be overtly sexual or make reference to things that would shock other people. And I think this is one of the other components in the exhibition is there's some large-scale photographs inside the exhibition, but there's also a separate gallery of photographs by Sheila Rock. And Sheila is an Asian-American photographer who was actually in London at the time, and in New York before that, photographing the proto-punk scene. But she was really part of the original kind of gang of people who were kind of hanging out together. Malcolm McLaren and the Sex Pistols and Generation X. And some of that was they went later on. They called themselves the Bromley Contingent, but even before that, before any of them were in bands. So that was Susie Sue and Billy Idol, and that's why Sheila has these amazing photographs of that scene really early on, and you really see that it's a bunch of kids. A lot of the people that were hanging out are 16, 17, and the people that were the musicians are maybe 19 or 20. They're not really very young.
Do you think that at that time that these kids could have suspected where that movement was going to take them?
No, I don't think so at all. I think it was really...
These weren't star-struck, ambitious, driven, as opposed to the Beatles, who play 10 hours a night in grubby Hamburg because they have a dream of being the next Elvis. Did these punks happen into fame?
I think so, yeah. I think I think everybody dreams of being successful to some extent, but I think there's a difference between dreaming and manifesting your ambition. And I think with a lot of the early punk scene, it was more about just doing it. It was a very short-term view in a lot of ways. They weren't thinking about a career. They weren't thinking about, what's my next album going to be. It was literally just, we're doing this right now. And a lot of them, burnt out really quickly as well. A lot of the bands realized either, they didn't like each other and didn't stick together, or they realized, I can only make this kind of music for a certain amount of period, and then I have to grow musically as well. And you see a lot of bands who, they start out being what you could call a quintessential punk rock band, and then they move away from it, and they broaden their perspective. They start to have more complex music, more complex lyrics. I think, the Clash was the prime example of that.
And that brings us here. We're standing in front of posters, and it's the Eurythmics, the Police, Frankie Goes to Hollywood. These are the bands that we grew up with on MTV. We don't think of as punk so much. They're much more polished. A lot of them fall under the new wave category, but this is where it led to in popular culture by the mid-'80s.
Yeah, so the other part of the exhibition is there's kind of mini sections, if you like. So there's 12 mini sections, and this section is really the end of the exhibition. It's into the 80s, and it's about some of those artists going mainstream. It's about, Billy Idol is suddenly on MTV all the time and breaking through in America. You've got the Police, who went from being a punk band playing at dive bars in Los Angeles to, being one of the most popular bands in the world at the time. And I think, in a way, I think there's an ethos to punk that on the one hand, you look at that and go, well, those people sold out. But then on the other hand, why wouldn't you want success for those people? Why wouldn't you want them to kind of grow and develop?
So getting back to the exhibit here, who is this exhibit for?
I think it has two audiences in my mind. I think one audience is old punk rockers who basically view it as nostalgia purely. And they want to come and they remember, I bought this record and I used to love this record. I went to see this band. It was one of my favorite gigs when I was 18. And then I think the other audience is actually a much younger audience. And for them, it's still history, but it's so far removed that it isn't a history that they're connected to. If you like, it's actually become a very historical exhibition in a way. They're looking at it as ancient history, if you like, not recent history.
A couple years ago, I was at a Damned show at the Theater of Living Arts in Philadelphia. The crowd skewed from about 70 down to early teens. It was an all-age show. Not what I expected to see there. As much as it's connected to a generational movement, this has clearly transcended generations.
I think so, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is actually the third iteration of this show. There was a version in Los Angeles, there was a smaller version in Dallas. And one of the things you really see is people coming to the show that have a different entry points to the music and different entry points to the culture. For some people, it's fashion. For some people, it's nostalgia. For other people, it's kind of discovery. It's a lot of the time, it'll be somebody that's really young who has just found out who New Order was. Then they put those connections together and they realize, oh, that's where this came from, and they were part of Joy Division, and Joy Division used to be kind of like a punk band. They were from Manchester, and they went to see the Sex Pistols and the Buzzcocks, and that's why they started a band. And you see them put these kind of threads together, and you see them really understand that network of kind of cultural history that goes along with music.
That was producer Richard Copeland speaking with Michael Worthington, co-curator of the Torn Apart exhibit at the Orlando Museum of Art that opens Saturday. Thank you for joining Engage. Stay tuned for All Things Considered following NPR News.